close your eyes. I mean, not if you're driving, if you're listening to this in your car, keep them open. But if you're sitting in front of your computer, your phone, just close your eyes for a second. Let's run a little experiment. Picture a white rabbit in a green field. Can you see it? And just take some time to notice the image. Is it cartoony? Is it realistic? What perspective is it from? Is the image changing as you look at it? Are more details filling in certain places, and in other places it's becoming less specific? Can you hold this image in your mind as I'm speaking? Or do you have to continually reimagine it and pull it up? Are there things moving? What's the rabbit look like? Can you make the rabbit move around if you want? Can you change the perspective? Can you move it around? Okay. You can open your eyes now. So these, I did a visualization survey with about 80 artists from Kansas City and some outside Kansas City, where I asked them these kind of questions. I went through in a conversation that ranged from anywhere from 45 minutes to 4 hours, where we would just go through all the different ways that their visual ability affected their thought. So I went through imagination, which is what I would call what we just did. But then there's also memory. And we think of memory as if memory is a different thing than imagination, but you're essentially creating images in your mind. But they have more of a relation to the truth. I went through navigational abilities where people were giving directions, mathematics. Oh, he's so cute. And anyway, a lot of different ones. But what I wanted to go over today is just 3 of the variables that I think are really important and that were surprising to me in terms of identifying the variety of visual experience that happens in cognition. So the first one is what I would call movement or animation. Right? So certain people, when they visualize, it is like they are watching a 4K high definition movie. And the movement is totally fluid and realistic, and everything looks exactly as it looks in real life. Right? And then some people can see movies and images, but it's a little choppier. It's almost as if there is a loss of frame rate. Then some people can see moving images, but they really only happen in like 3 to 4 second GIFs, where they just kind of loop, and they don't really have much control over the actual thing that they're seeing. They just can kind of repeat it over and over and over. And some people can only see still images. So they can flip from one still image to the next still image to the next still image, but they have a really hard time actually making anything move. And some people, like myself, don't see any images at all. And that is called aphantasia. I don't see images when I think. And because I don't see images when I think, it made me very curious about how other people are experiencing this phenomena. And I rightly concluded that there is probably not just the difference of seen images and not seen images, but that there is this variety of experience in terms of visualization. So that's what I was trying to chart here. So movement, animation, that's the first variable that I saw that there was a range of experience. The second one I'd like to talk about is control. How much control do you feel like you have over the image that you're experiencing in your mind? Now, some people, we could have entire conversations and they could hold that image of their rabbit and it was a stable image. They could talk, I could talk, it was still there, right? And then they felt like nothing in that image happened that they didn't intend. Now, some people, when we were having this conversation, the image would disappear, right? Their mind would move to something else, and then they would have to rethink of the image, and they'd have to recreate it, and then they weren't quite certain whether this was the same image as the one they were looking for or not. It was kind of hard to tell. And there were a few people who felt like they didn't have, or that certain things happened in their imagination that they didn't really feel like they decided to do or that they intended. One of my favorite stories, somebody was picturing a white rabbit in a field, and all of a sudden a herd of buffalo just goes across the field, and they laugh. They laugh because this is a surprise to them. They didn't intend for a herd of buffalo to come by, but they did. And it was so surprising that it made them laugh out loud. That's a pretty fascinating thing to have happened. That the mind is making decisions, and we feel as if we have a responsibility over some of those decisions, but not others. And I'll get back to this point later. And then finally, in that range of people having control over not having control, there were people who could visualize things, but it was as if their visual world was in a constant flux, and almost like a constant associative flux. So if they would picture a rabbit, then they might picture a hat, or then that hat might transform into a building, and then that building might transform into a lake. And it was just this like never-ending mutation of world that they could very partially try and hold on to and direct. But the mutations were just constant. So that's the range in terms of control. The third attribute I wanted to talk about was, would you stop biting my fingers? What is it with you and fingers? The third one, this is hard with him. The third one is, it's like the phenomenological experience of truth in that world. I know that's kind of like a strange way to say it. People had feelings about making decisions in their imaginative world that violated truth. Maybe that's a better way to say it. I know that sounds like a very long variable, but this was a very unexpected thing that I noticed, which is that I first discovered it. So part of when I would talk to people about a memory, and maybe somebody remembered this experience they had with their mother when she was in the hospital. And one of the things I would do is I would have them like, well, can you change certain details in this memory? And so, yeah, sure, I could try to do that. I was like, okay, so tell me what the wallpaper looks like. Oh, there's pink wallpaper in the hospital. It's like, well, can you make it green? Yeah, it kind of feels bad, but yeah, I can do that. It's like, okay, tell me what your mother's wearing. Oh, she's wearing this particular dress. Can you change the details of the dress? Absolutely not. No. Like people didn't want certain details of that messed with because they felt that they were more and more consequential to the emotional content of the memory and the truth of the memory, which totally understandable. You don't want somebody kind of like poking around and messing with the details of a memory. But, of course, in some cases in these memories, they were seeing themselves in this image. So they knew that the image was entirely fabricated. And that this wasn't actually a true image, that this was, a similar thing about the imaginative capacity of the mind to be able to create these images that were connected to these, particularly intense emotional experiences that they had. But that wasn't just the case with memory or kind of more intimate, powerful memories. People had this same reaction when I would ask them, hey, can you see your house? Can you stand outside of your house? How many windows are in it? They tell me. They'd be like, what color is your house? Oh, my house is white. It's like, oh, can you make your house blue? God, and they would make this face. They would just be like, and it would hurt them. It would hurt them, and it would feel bad. They reported it as being repulsed by it, feeling bad, because they were making something that they knew to be true untrue. My house is white, you're asking me to make it blue. And it was almost as if the color blue would sit on top of the White House and it would shake. And then the second that they would stop trying to make it blue, it would just immediately disappear. Now, certain people I talked to had no problem doing this at all, right? I was like, make your house blue? Yeah, it's blue. Make it pink? Sure, no problem. Add a second story to it? Can do that too. One of the other things that we went through was, look at your house, look to the left. What's to the left of your house? Oh, there's your neighbor's house. Can you switch houses? Can you put your house where your neighbor's house is and your neighbor's house where your house is? Well, some people would do this and they would take certain realistic details of the world and recreate them in their mind. So when they would pick their house up, they would pick it up and this giant mound of dirt underneath it would come up, and then all of the water pipes would break and water would start spraying over everywhere, and they would try to move the house where their neighbor's house is, but of course their neighbor's house is there. So they have to do the same thing with their neighbor's house. They have to pick it up, kind of move it around, set the house down, but maybe the mound of dirt didn't quite fit with the space, the empty space that was there, and it was this very hard problem to solve, right? They attached all sorts of realistic details to this particular problem, where some people didn't do that. Some people just could almost like Photoshop, just whoosh, switch the images, and maybe the images wouldn't sit perfectly in that space, but it was just, they were content with just kind of like a bad Photoshop collage. And then in some with the rabbit, I would ask them, make the rabbit a different color, make the rabbit, pink with black spots. They didn't like to do that. That felt bad too. Even in kind of the imaginative realm, if I asked them to do things that violated the rules of this world, that felt bad. So that's the third. That's the third variable. One, all three I think could be vitally important to understanding how people's minds work. Right? Do they? How does it feel to have imaginative problem solving, and how realistic is that world to this one? So I bring all this up, one, because I just think it's endlessly fascinating, and right now there is this, what's the best way to say this? So right now, when we have these public debates about issues, one of the go-to ways to describe how you think somebody arrived at their particular thought is to assign them 3 categories: your skin color, your sex, and your sexual orientation. Right? So, the reason that you're thinking this way is because you're a straight white man, right? And that kind of has this explanatory power of how your mind works, which is true. There is some explanatory power to those 3 variables. But what I found was, in talking to all these different people, that there is this, that the mind is a more complex, more, has more variables that are hidden in terms of how people's minds actually work. It's not apparent looking at somebody if they can simulate 4K high definition motion, can have total control over their internal visual ability, and it doesn't feel bad at all to manipulate that world in any way possible, right? The only way that we can really understand how our minds are working is if we sit down with one another and have these conversations and try to explain it. Like, these are some of my favorite conversations. I have them all recorded. Someday I might do something with them, because they touch on a lot of other variables than the ones I described. But those I thought those really stood out to me as the ones that were valuable to know. So I think that's all I have to say. What do you think, Henry? You don't care. I guess, okay, let's end with this. So I was recently involved in this brief internet controversy, which I won't go into in detail. But one of the sidebar arguments that happened was this thing where I kind of laid out a very short version of this argument, and then the conversation turned slightly to, oh, well, Jory can't see images in his mind. That must mean that he lacks empathy, or that those two things are connected. And this is not a bad, although it's incredibly condescending. It's not, I understand where that thought comes from, because while I had these conversations about people's internal visual ability, it also occurred to me that maybe this had something to do with empathy. And so empathy, there's 2 different ways people use that word. The definitions around this are sloppy. But basically, there is emotional empathy, the idea that you are trying to simulate the feelings that you think another human being is having. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is understanding the psychological state and contextual position of another human being. Right? And those 2 things don't have to coincide with one another. I can understand the psychological state of another human being without actually feeling those feelings. For instance, and this is the example that Paul Bloom gives in his book, Against Empathy. If you see a person drowning in a lake, you do not spring into action because you simulate what it is like to be drowning and have to experience what it is like to be drowning. You don't even ever have to do that to know that drowning is bad and that you want to help this person, right? So that there's, in a lot of cases, you do not have to experience the feelings. And in some cases, experiencing the feelings of somebody would be bad, right? It would be bad if the way that empathy worked was that you had to simulate the emotional experience of a drowning person, which would make it very hard to save a drowning person, right? It would be much better if you didn't do that and just immediately sprung into action. But I was curious, how does my lack of an imagistic world affect empathy in the sense that I try to simulate the feelings of other people? And I think when you're dealing with abstract scenarios or stories, right? If somebody's telling me a story, if they're saying, my brother, he was driving, it was a family road trip. It was around Christmas. There was this freak ice storm when they were going down the highway, and kids are in the back seat. One of them was playing with a Rubik's Cube. They're talking, not really paying attention, and they hit some black ice. The car spins around, smashes into a guardrail, and his head smacks into the window. Right? I can tell that story and not see anything. But some people are seeing this little movie play out. And that little movie that plays out comes with emotional content. And so I think there is a difference in that particular scenario. If you want me to think about those types of situations, that doesn't come with a lot of emotional content to me. But that does not mean I lack empathy, because I have eyes and I can see out into the world, and I can respond to people's emotional cues that are in front of me. So when I watch movies, I have become a big softie as I've gotten older, where I cry more often than movies when I see somebody else cry, or when there's somebody in front of me who is crying. It also makes me possibly well up with tears. So again, it is this very specific context in which I don't have a particular emotional experience when I think about things. And that's not a deficiency, right? Because, it could be a deficiency in certain situations, but it could also be an advantage in others, right? This is the variability of mind. And this is the diversity of mind. And what we would want to do is use that diversity to our advantage, right? Like, people that have this particular way of thinking might be better suited to certain environments than other people. For instance, being a psychologist, being somebody who is dealing with people going through traumatic events and constantly telling stories about them, right? So that you would not have to relive the stories that they are telling in this movie in your mind that comes with all this emotional content. A lot of people that bogs them down. It's depressing having to have that kind of emotional contagion that happens. And so, right? So, anyway, okay, I think I'm done. Look at this guy. You want to let me... Sorry, I think it is an interesting conversation. It's a conversation about the relationship between empathy and visualization that I'd love to have. And if you are someone who is more interested in this visualization stuff, please reach out to me. I haven't done the test in a long time, but I have a pretty long test that I can go through, and we can talk about it. All right.